Just a little comment, and my apologies once again. I'm sort of using these Sunday homilies to give a little bit of teaching on some of the difficulties of our times. So I do apologize sometimes for the length if it's a little bit burdensome for some. But I'm just wanting to take the opportunity because I'm aware that a greater number will tune in on a Sunday and then also tune in for the homily. We're in a difficult time in the church where we don't always have the light that we need from the higher levels and from the hierarchy. And so that often means that people are searching around in the confusion, looking for the thing that can give them the security that they would normally have. And especially when we're facing difficult, complex moral situations, people feel a little bit bewildered and they look around and sometimes grab onto things that might be minor opinions or on the fringes of the discussion. And I say this in regard to the vaccine. A number of people, I've had communications of various kinds and have become aware that some people are perturbed in their conscience, worried in their conscience that taking the vaccine would be sinful or even mortally sinful. And I just want to address this topic today. The church knows the complexity of our world. We're in a fallen, broken world. She knows that at times we cannot get away from the evil that is around us. We're in the world but not of the world. And thereby in her moral theology, and the great moral theologian Alphonsus Liguori was the one who really began to unfold the way that we look at these things in the church teaching. And building upon him are others like John Paul II, and there are documents from the Magisterium, from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And there are other great theologians. Germain Grisset is one of them, a 20th century layman who has written excellent books, very good books on moral theology by and large. And sometimes there are disputed questions and different moral theologians take different positions. The church has seen clearly, and I'm sure many of us know the basics, that when it comes to intrinsic evils and our cooperation in them, that we can never formally cooperate. And the church makes a distinction between formal cooperation and material cooperation, and then the different kinds of material cooperation. Formal cooperation would be where someone would agree with something, and when it comes to an evil, an intrinsic evil, a Catholic can never formally agree with such a thing in any kind of cooperation. So abortion is a good example today. But there can be times in human life where we get stuck in community because we live with others and we're involved with other human beings in relation to the common good, where there can be certain questions around material cooperation and evil, including intrinsic evil. And then the question comes up for someone who's wanting to live their moral life, live the commandments, be faithful to Christ. Sometimes, how and when should I always avoid it? If I have to cooperate with it, to what degree, how, etc. These are all questions that have been worked out by the church in complex situations because sometimes people get trapped. And the church, when we speak of material cooperation, a person may not be agreeing with any evil act, but they might be providing some kind of material assistance, whether it's financial, money being paid, materials being given, or even bodily assistance, skills being offered. So for example, if a nurse was working for a clinic and they wanted her to come into the theatre to assist a doctor doing an abortion, and she was to hand him the implements, she may not, as a Catholic, agree with the abortion at all. She might find the abortion abhorrent, but she might think that it would be okay to provide material assistance in the clinic theatre by handing the instruments. That is an example of a material cooperation which is proximate. It's very close to the evil act being undertaken by the doctor and being agreed to by many other persons, including the one receiving the abortion. And that is illicit, that is immoral to do so. That kind of proximity, that kind of closeness to an intrinsic evil, the church is very clear. We cannot formally cooperate, and we also cannot materially, proximately, actively cooperate. Both of those are out for a Catholic. But there can be times when a Catholic is forced to, or in a situation where they materially but remotely cooperate, either in a passive or an active way. And there, sometimes we can cooperate in an intrinsic evil remotely, materially, sometimes it's passively and sometimes it's actively. And it depends on the situation as to whether we can or not. The general rule is to try to reduce that cooperation as best we can, and in certain situations we look for another option. And that's obvious. Same with the principle of double effect. We are undertaking an act, it might have a good and bad consequence that comes out of it. We would normally know about the evil consequence. We don't intend that, but we tolerate it because we're intending the good that we know also, and the good outweighs the evil. And that's the principle of double effect that goes on a lot in human life. But one of the criteria of double effect is that we cannot undertake that act if there's another act over here by which we can accomplish the same end, the same good to be intended, if there's no evil effect. And thereby we're morally obliged to choose that act because there's no evil effect that comes out of that one versus the other one which would have it. But look, this is very complex because they are very simple black and white sort of situations. Sometimes things are very black and white and we can see clearly. But just to give you an example about how we are involved in material, remote cooperation, active and passive, all the time in the modern world with intrinsic evil, where we don't often take the road of elimination. For example, when we go down to the beer shop, the bottle shop, and we buy some alcohol, we are funding a business that's providing a legitimate good, but we know that other people will go in there and buy alcohol and get drunk and abuse it. And because we're funding that business that then is providing alcohol to others who will abuse that legitimate good alcohol, we are materially, remotely, actively participating in an intrinsic evil because of the connection and the common good in the community. If we were the bottle shop owner, even more, because we're providing alcohol to people who will abuse it. And it is a remote, material, active cooperation in an intrinsic evil, drunkenness. And that goes on across many things. When we go to the local dairy, if he's selling pornography on the local stand, and we're just buying milk, which is perfectly legitimate, we are materially, remotely, actively participating in an intrinsic evil, the promulgation of pornography, which also funds the making of the pornography, and then the use of the pornography and the subsequent sins that come from that. And that goes on all the time in today's world. We're in such a world that's enmeshed in evil everywhere, intrinsic evils, that it's very, very hard to extricate oneself from remote, material, active or passive cooperation. When we pay our taxes not only go to fund the abortion industry in New Zealand, it's funding so many other intrinsic evils, the whole homosexual agenda, gay marriage and the implementation of gay marriage, civil unions of the various kinds. It's funding adultery in various ways, fornication by the sex ed in the schools, contraception everywhere because of the way the government funds it or the way it's taught in the schools. It's funding the homosexual agenda and the legitimization of all of that stuff, including the transgender agenda. All the way that the socialist government is indoctrinating the children in the schools. When we pay taxes, we are materially, remotely, actively participating in those intrinsic evils. And the church has been very clear through its teaching consistently, and it's been the widespread practice of millions and millions of Catholics, that we pay our taxes around the world when we know a certain proportion and percentage of it pays for intrinsic evils. And many of us do not feel, and this is true of the teaching of the church as well, there has never been a document that came out from John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Pius XII, anybody else saying that you must stop paying your taxes and suffer the consequences in order to eliminate one's material, remote, active or passive cooperation in such things. There is just an acceptance that we are in a fallen, broken world in which evil goes on everywhere. You could say it for a nurse working in a hospital, a good Catholic nurse who's doing wonderful work, and there's an abortion facility in the bottom story of the hospital. She's actively helping at a remote distance, materially, in an intrinsic evil. Should she resign And should every doctor, and should we all withdraw from society because of the way that intrinsic evils are now promoted at almost every level? Should we stop purchasing at the supermarket because they have the green tick, which shows that they're rainbow friendly, or the gasoline station who has the green tick because they're actively supporting the homosexual agenda and lifestyle? Almost every business that has a green tick. If we were to be entirely pure and get ourselves out of any remote material cooperation, we would have to do an analysis of every business, of every material and financial transaction, and withdraw our consent and cooperation in order to be clean in a Catholic way. And we don't do that because we accept the reality and the difficulty of the reality of our time. If we were, we would have to go and live in the hills and provide our own electricity and our own water and just live by subsistence. Now, some might choose to do that, but the moral obligation upon us from the Lord is not saying that every Catholic must withdraw from society in order to be morally away from such cooperation. And so I say all of that to drill down to looking at the vaccine. Because some lines of the vaccine, and in New Zealand we only have access to the Pfizer vaccine, and they are on record in their documentation, they've shown that they have used the aborted fetal line HEK 293 from the 1970s in the initial testing of the vaccine. It is not in the structure of the vaccine and the molecular makeup of the vaccine. We do not know. They have not told us whether it's in the quality control and assurance of the vaccine. They might be taking every 1,000th sample off the production line and then injecting it into those fetal cells and seeing whether it still works. That might be involved in the quality control process. We don't know. What we do know, and they've admitted this, it's in their documentation, that cell line has been used in the initial testing of the vaccine. And that overall process, yes, is called the manufacturing process. So it's involved somehow. There is a taintedness in the Pfizer vaccine. But we have to make some important distinctions. They are immortalized cell lines, and I'm no biologist. I don't know and understand any of this. All I know is what the doctors have said. They are copies of those cells, that they've done a special process, they've immortalized them so that they last and they can continue to use them in their biological experiments. Now, it's an evil. It's a terrible, abhorrent thing. We hate it. And in order to get enough biological fetal cell line to be able to do all of that immortalization and use that now 60 years later or whatever it is, 50 years later, they have had to do probably 100 abortions to get all of that material. So it is an horrific thing that Catholics rightly and ordinarily are disgusted by and don't want to have to participate in. And that's perfectly legitimate and it's the right reaction. But when we have no other option, there is only the Pfizer vaccine available in New Zealand. We would love there to be an ethical version of it and also one that's effective and safe and necessary, etc. Then the question becomes, can we materially, remotely, and this time it's passive because we're not actively paying for the thing, we're just passively receiving the thing, remote, material, passive cooperation in the participation in the abortion industry are the goods to be gained by taking the vaccine and the evils to be avoided by taking the vaccine. Do those outweigh the participation in those abortions that happened in the 1970s and the ongoing use of such things, the propagation of that whole industry where they use abortion in that way? That's the weighing up. Now, some have said on the fringes, I must say, and one of the articles was on LifeSite News, which is a great website, but it was just one opinion of one priest saying that it's a mortal sin because the proportionate goods to be gained and evils to be avoided do not outweigh the evil of participation remotely, passively, and materially in the abortion industry. Now, that is not true. That is just one opinion of one priest, and it is not the position of the magisterium in these matters. It is not a mortal sin to take the vaccine on these grounds because we do so many other things in daily life that participate in intrinsic evils in a remote, material, active way, including other medicines. Let me give you an example. Aspirin, Dispirin have been developed by using HEK 293 in their initial processing. And it seems that ivermectin, which is one of the alternative drugs to try to help with the fight against COVID, has also used HEK293 in its testing. And I don't know about the exact tablets that are delivered by particular manufacturers, whether they have, but I have found evidence that ivermectin has used those things in their testing. So many products that we use in the medical world, if we were to really say that it was a mortal sin to use any product that had been involved in such fetal lines, cell lines, we would have to create a massive list of medicines that we would not want to take, because otherwise we would be mortally sinful in taking them. And the Vatican and the magisterium of the last 100 years has not produced any such lists and looked at them. They're inconsistent teaching, and it's true of all the good theologians in this area have said that it is morally licit to take the vaccine because it's material, remote, passive cooperation. But there are a number of other criteria in there. We should fight back and prophetically take a stance, and I wished that the Pope and the magisterium and the bishops of the world had demanded an ethical vaccine at the very beginning. That could have been a fantastic teaching moment of the entire Catholic Church to stand up to the pharmaceutical world and say, give us a vaccine that's morally developed. We didn't do that, so then, okay, we can still push back with prophetic words. We have to assess a number of other criteria in the whole debate around the vaccine. But on the moral front, is it sinful? The Church has been very, very clear. There is no sin in taking such a vaccine if other criteria are weighed up and it is deemed medically necessary, and in terms of the social good and the social responsibility, if it is necessary, then one can take the vaccine in good conscience without any qualms before God. Now, I hope that's clear and it's got some cogency to it. I just wanted to say that because I'm just aware that people are very stressed about these things and are very concerned in their conscience about the vaccine and the taking of it. Be at peace. If one measures up all the other criteria, one can peacefully receive the vaccine and there is no sin involved. But one can also legitimately come to another conclusion, and I've spoken about this in the previous weeks. Someone might deem, with all the research in front of them and they've done their job, they say, I don't believe it's necessary for me to take the vaccine, and also I would prefer not to encourage the medical industry to continue using aborted fetal lines. Fine. But if one took the other position, because of all of the weighing up and the analysis, the risk-benefit analysis they did, there would be no sin, morally speaking, in receiving a vaccine that has been made in that way, especially the Pfizer one that we're facing. My apologies once again for the length, but I just thought it's a bit easier when people are on a live stream to give a longer homily, because people can maybe pause and come back or watch it at another time. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please forgive me, there is one further point that I thought was important. Just to make it clear, and maybe this will be something that will convince a few others that are still doubtful. God himself actually materially cooperates in sin for a greater good, which is the redemption of Christ to be offered in the midst of a broken world, and then ultimately greater glory to be received in heaven. When the devil rebels against God, God is holding him in being. And he continues to hold him in being even whilst there is an eternal rebellion in the mind and will of the devil. God provides the matter for his existence, spirit, in which there is a rebellion against him, and he continually provides that support in which the devil eternally sins. That is true for anyone who sins. God holds them in being and provides often other good things for them whilst they might even be in a sinful lifestyle, or it might be a one-off sin. If God, in his own way, and he's a little bit different, so it's only analogy, there's a vast distance between our cooperation and the way that God does this, but there's a tiny thread of similarity. It's what we call an analogy. If God is capable of doing that, he holds us in being even whilst we're sinning. He's never formally guilty of any sin. He is never directly assisting sin. That would be blasphemy to accuse him of that. But he holds the whole world, the cosmos in being, whilst there are all sorts of agents within that world which are rebelling against him, sometimes hating him, and he doesn't stop and wipe it out because he thinks it would be illegitimate to provide materials whilst that sinfulness is going on. If God can do that, then it becomes a matter of discernment to what degree we can or cannot do such things. It's important to look at that sometimes, to consider that there's a bigger picture going on when we speak of cooperation. And for the sake of a greater good, always. We cannot just participate in evil for the sake of it. Participate sometimes and allow it, tolerate it, for the sake of a greater good. God does it by allowing the original sin and all other sin so that he can provide Christ. St. Paul says God allows all to be conceived in disobedience so that he can give mercy to all. It's Romans. It's what he does in Christ. And then ultimately it's so that all can receive a greater glory insofar as they might receive that salvation. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.